Brothers and sisters, how can humility help us deal with the ebb and flow of desolation and consolation? So we've been speaking about this general pattern in the spiritual life, times where we feel God's presence, we have a sense of Him, where things seem so clear, and then times of desolation where we might feel that God is far, that God has forgotten us, that we can't even barely face our good resolutions to follow Him on the spiritual path, etc. And the secret to all of this is humility. Humility protects us in both cases. Humility in desolation reminds us that God is great and that I am small, but that God can do everything. And humility safeguards our hope, because if in desolation we relied on ourselves, a form of pride, we would become quickly discouraged. We will quite quickly cave in. But if we put our hope outside of ourselves and in God, even in the face of our frailty, in the face of everything collapsing, our hope would have a greater stability in God. And we should never put our hope in things like politics and economics and finance and even relationships and technology. And these things will come and go. I mean, certainly they can help us to have some kind of positive experience of life when they are run well. But ultimately, they all collapse, they fade, they change, they're subject to the winds of the world. And so our hope is in God, who's permanent and stable. And that is our stability for this spiritual life. He's our anchor. But at the same time, in consolation, in times of consolation, we could risk doing silly things or being exaggerate in our behaviors and our choices. And we could make lavish decisions. And as we said in an earlier video, that, we could even make resolutions we're quite frankly are not able to keep. So humility safeguards us too in those moments of consolation, because we realize that, that we might take on a greater sober view of ourselves and of God, and also, part of the virtue of moderation, virtue of temperance, to moderate our desires from excesses, great excesses. St. Ignatius would say, let one who is consoled seek to humble himself and lower himself as much as he can, thinking of how little he is capable in the time of desolation, without such grace or consolation. So he's saying that when you're in a consolation, remind yourself of those times of desolation where you could do nothing without God, and how quickly you could go back into that state. And this would humble you. He says, on the contrary, let one who is in desolation think that he can do much with God's sufficient grace to resist all his enemies, taking strength in his Creator and Lord. So when one is in desolation, you put that hope in the Lord, that humbling, trusting act that it was not dependent on you, but God can bring you out of this. And this way, you will also find that stability in your spiritual life. And now, this pattern, as you go through this life and you experience these ebbs and flow, we've said that you build up an experience of this, and this too shall pass. And then also you will have more experience from the times where you have caved into desolation, caved into the ill effects that could come from consolation. And you require more of a stable path with the Lord. And there's nothing but just life, to walk through life and experience these movements. But now I think if we're aware of these movements, where we know how to remain at peace. Because remember, all of this is about safeguarding peace, which is an urgent, very important task for us to navigate the spiritual life, is to remain at peace. As Father Jacques Philippe says, you cannot see your face, you cannot see your true self when, and I would say God as well, when the water is turbulent. You can't see the reflection in the water until the water is perfectly calm. Can we see the reflection of God in ourselves, I would say, and hear God, and listen to his voice. So these are just a few thoughts today on this rule number 11. And we pray for as St. Augustine would say, what's the Christian virtue? Humility, humility, humility. And St. Thomas Aquinas would say humility is not just, being a doormat or throwing yourself down on the ground. Humility is completely compatible with magnanimity, which is another great Christian virtue, which is largeness of soul, which is a virtue that demands great things of yourself for the sake of God, to do great things for God. The saints show us that, then settle for mediocrity. But humility recognizes the truth. And part of that humility is recognizing, well, everything comes from God that is good, and that I give him thanks, and that I'm aware that even my freedom is a gift from him, and that he's at work even in my freedom to move me, which is a mystery. But he is also completely and utterly like I said, gracious, and that all my gifts that I have, a humble person could recognize the strengths of their gifts that they have and give God thanks for those gifts, recognizing those gifts come from God and not taking any prideful boast in those gifts. But we could recognize the gifts. Otherwise, how will we be filled with gratitude at the deepest core of our being for the gifts He's given us? And sometimes we cannot see our gifts, and maybe the Lord sometimes veils that to keep us humble in another sense, because we might risk pride by boasting in our gifts. But maybe when we reach that certain part of the spiritual life, He'll start to uncover yourself to yourself, and you will rejoice in the wonder of your being, who He made you to be, in the most beautiful, humble way. So let us give praise to God.